Hi. Hi, thanks for having me. I guess my question's mainly to Mr. Burke. As a small business owner, I'm increasingly concerned about what seems to be a significant bias in recent industrial relations reforms, which tend to favour employees often at the expense of employers. So, for example, the right to disconnect focuses on protecting employees' personal time outside of work hours, but it doesn't address employees using paid work time for personal matters, such as private calls on their mobile phones or engaging in non-work related activities during business hours. So obviously fair work environments are important. So how can the government ensure that its policies support both the workers and the small businesses that employ them?
Tony.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. There are common interests. There are common interests there. And one of the things where the question goes to the example of, what if someone's using their work time for personal use? The employer already had, and has had forever, the power and the right to crack down on that if they're not happy about it. The right that wasn't there was if the worker was being unreasonably contacted outside of work hours, outside of paid hours, to be able to push back. Now, effectively, the right to disconnect just takes us all back to the right to our own time that people had, say, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if someone was on call, they carried a beeper, and if the beeper went off, they'd use someone's landline and they'd call in. And you knew you were on call and you were paid an allowance. Then, all of a sudden, we all started carrying our own beepers. And it started to drift so that you've had a situation where a lot of workers are being unreasonably contacted constantly and didn't have the right to push back. So what this right means, the employer is still able to reach out, but the worker has a right that catches up with modern technology, where they can now say, that email can wait till Monday. But obviously, if there's something that's urgent, if you're the only person who's got the alarm codes or the give and take that's normally there, then you're going to respond. But if it gets out of hand, there was a right for the employer always to crack down on what happened during work time. Now, for the first time, there's a right for the worker to defend their off time.
Simon. A whole bunch of people who are very sick of getting emails out of hours, I'm guessing there. But Simon, what are your concerns about it? Because how does it affect your work? What is the concern that you hold?
Well, one of the issues is employees using personal time during work hours, and I don't think it's as straightforward as what Tony is making out, because disciplining employees and things like that often damages workplace morale and stuff like that. So it kind of feels like the government's backing one side, but not so much the other. Like I didn't really understand the purpose of this law in the first place, because people I speak to, in my experience, is that employees do personal stuff during work time far more than bosses contact employees outside of work hours.
Okay.
So to me,
has that been a problem in your business, and have you ever used the laws that Tony refers to?
Which laws are you talking about?
Well,
sorry?
the ones he referred to, where you can discipline workers or say, hey, you're spending too much time looking at, real estate websites.
I have had to speak to workers at time and, bring them back into line and stuff like that. But sometimes you get pushback and things like that. So, it's not always easy and straightforward. Running a business is a hard job, and extra legislation makes it harder.
Okay. Paul Fletcher, your side of politics is against this. You've said you'll repeal it if you are elected. Why do you think it needs to be repealed?
Well, firstly, whenever Tony uses his reasonable voice, be on alert, frankly, because, he said, oh, well, if somebody's got the codes, it's fine. Look at the actual words of the legislation, which I might add was put in without consultation with any employer groups. It was put in at the last minute after a deal was done with the Greens. There wasn't proper consultation on how this is going to work. So it's not even clear, for example, if an employer texts somebody to say there's an extra shift tomorrow or next day, do you want to do that? It's not even clear whether that'll breach the provisions.
Yes, it
is. Don't forget that there are significant civil penalties that are payable if you breach this. And by the way, the first version had criminal penalties. So he's sounding very reasonable, but this is something that was done in a rushed and irresponsible way. But fundamentally what it does is it breaches the trust that in good businesses and with good employees builds up between people. The fact is that the flexibility of being able to step out of work, to take an elderly parent, to a doctor, to pick up a child from school is something that is now feasible because your boss knows that they can get you if something is urgent on the phone. So many of those flexible arrangements people have arrived at in a very sensible fashion. This rigidity will add cost, add complexity, and we'll see good businesses incurring costs and being, frankly, discouraged from treating employees with the flexibility that many of them already do.
Paul, do you think people should work for free?
No, I don't think people should work for free, and I don't think that's, frankly, a very, putting words in people's mouths is not a good way to deal with a serious issue. No, I don't think people should work for free. Of course I don't.
No, neither do I.
We've got to go back to the root cause here, which is there's like a second epidemic of burnout. And I think what we're trying to do is to protect workers, right? If we think about protecting workers and saying, do we have a fair balance of work and remuneration and reward and a fair amount of personal time to do your own thing, I think the intent behind the policy is great. Questionable whether it was done in the right way, but if the intent is to say, when you finish your work, you can have reasonable time to be a human, for me to be a dad outside of work and not be distracted, I think that's a good thing if we can find a way of finding that balance.
But does it have to be in the law?
I think you need something there. You need something there that can be defended, because right now we keep on going back 20 years, and we've already agreed that 20 years ago the world was very different. So the modern leadership we require right now is a new muscle, and not every business has it. So whilst we're growing that muscle, we might need some policy and structure to give ourselves the chance.
Okay,
that's the point. It's technology.
I just want to, Simon, thank you for putting your question to us. I just want to go to you, Carolyn, if I can. Do you think it's a necessary right, and would your workers want to use it?
Yeah, I think there's this whole thing about treating workers as adults and actually being good managers. So a good manager is going to let a worker go off and take an elderly parent to a doctor's appointment. But, I have a signature, and lots of people, we give everyone at Carmen's an option to say, I've sent this email at a time that suits me. I don't expect you to reply until it's a time that suits you. So there's an expectation in your organisation, and if you're setting that, and it's got to come from the top down, and I do think there is a sense that sometimes there's organisations that think that people should be working 24/7. Yeah. And so I think there's, organisations have to take some responsibility around that. If someone is an early bird and wants to work early, or if someone says, do you know what, I want to do the school drop-off, but I'm very happy to log back on and do that bit of work there. It's about outcome rather than necessarily...
So that's the way you run
hours.
your business, because presumably it's about worker retention and making it like your holiday plan is that, can I work for you?
Joking.
But Carolyn, you've created a culture where people want to work and are treated like adults, and in return deliver great work. You have really high retention.
But do you think it needs to be the law?
Yes, I do.
Yes, because laws aren't written for the good employers.
Yes.
Like, we don't need them for the good employers. We need them for the...
And your concern, Paul, is, because obviously there's a couple of people who are in business here who say that this is the way to treat workers. Your concern is that it will be misused?
Our concern is that, number one, the process in getting to it was terrible. Because
but beyond the process,
when you
the
say
law
beyond
itself...
when you say beyond the process, because there was not consultation with businesses about how this is going to work in a practical sense. But secondly, despite the minimising tone from the Minister, the simple fact is that companies that breach this, employers that breach this, are exposed to civil penalties. There's nothing in it which talks about, oh, well, it's fine if it's a code that's urgent. Nobody's disputing the principle that there are times that people are employed to work for, and there are times when people are on their personal time.
But if they're being interrupted, this gives them the right.
But the question is whether it is desirable to bake that into the law with all of the rigidities that come with it in a way that was not properly considered, not properly consulted on.
But what's the worst-case scenario? What could happen?
Well, one of the things, frankly, that a lot of business in Western Australia, for example, are very concerned about is Western Australia is 2 hours behind 3 hours at other times of the year, that you could have significant times when those in one state are not free to speak with fellow employees in another state. There's a lot of practical consequences.
With your workers.
The West Australian example became very prominent because it appeared on the front page of the West Australian newspaper as a problem that would hit West Australian businesses. Guess what the West Australian newspaper have in their own enterprise agreement? A heading, right to disconnect. They've got the clause in their own agreement.
I think we've got to choose if we treat people like resources or humans, and I think the modern work era means that we should treat them like humans, and humans deserve the right to disconnect.
OK.